Okay, and we are back to international law. Okay, so, we know that if we are polluting, if we're releasing things into the air or into the water, that does not an international boundary will not limit the spread of that pollution. So the EPA actually has an Office of International Affairs, and they work to connect the EPA initiatives to projects of other nations. Um, a lot of stuff that goes on is treaties, and I'll get into that a little bit when I get into the climate change in a little bit. But agreements between different countries, and there's been a lot going on lately with agreements between countries to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases. So sometimes, your treaties are economic or territorial, um, and yeah, there have been a couple of these environmental agreements in the past 20 years. Another category with regard to treaties are protocols. So, say you have a general agreement in a treaty. The protocol are like mini agreements on how to make sure the terms of the treaties actually come to fruition, right? The mini agreements on the terms of treaties. So that's another tool between countries to help work together for environmental issues, be it anti-poaching laws, right, for endangered species, or greenhouse gases might be another example. The UN also plays a big part in promoting environmental sustainability, working to slow climate change. They have they have a page on the UN site, un.org, and then there is a sustainable development and climate action section of that page if you want to look at that. So they started that in 2015, and they, hold a bunch of summits, right, with between countries to, work on slowing down the climate change and working together to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So then they also have another web page, which is the UNFCCC.int. So this is the United Nations climate change page. So again, they have all these summits, and countries and leaders go to them. Big issue now is, first world nations giving economic assistance to underdeveloped nations to help them with these problems, help them reduce their carbon footprint as well. One of the things we'll talk about in a minute, when we're talking about the different presidents in the past, 20 years or so, President Biden has really taken these, international UN summits to heart, and he's attended a bunch of them since he has become president. So he's kind of the first, like, very actively pro environmental, or anti climate change, and working together with other countries uh, to promote sustainable development. The thing about the United Nations is, right, so that's just like a group of countries who work together to maintain peace and, work on other humanitarian issues, right? But they can't make laws. They can't say, United States, you have to reduce your emissions. China, you have to reduce your emissions. Nigeria, you have to do X, Y, or Z. They can just recommend and have people talk, and but they have no lawmaking powers or enforceability. Um, so another kind of international relation in our country is relations with the Native American tribes. So a lot of the Native American reservations are on federal land. So this reservation land is usually governed by the federal environmental laws. Tribes might also have their own laws. Um, if they want to, and well, when we go more into the Clean Air and Clean Water Act, we'll talk about how some states actually are the watchdogs and the administrators of Clean Air and Clean Water Act provisions. So the tribes can also do that. They just have to apply for what we call treatment as a state status, and they would be the ones enforcing and administering the federal laws. Now, sometimes things that arise are jurisdictional battles between the state, where if you say you're in Arizona and there's a reservation in Arizona and they have a disagreement on how the environmental laws should be enforced, there might be some jurisdictional battles there. So that's kind of the process with Native American tribes. But like a lot of the international stuff really, starts and ends with climate change. So we're kind of going to talk about this. And again, this is part that is not in the book. So pay attention to the PowerPoint and the lecture if you can. So you have all the information. Um, big news. Our Congress has not passed any laws focused on climate change or the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions specifically. Okay, they have a lot of laws about studying climate change, reporting, assessing climate change, but no real laws, right? They don't have like the equivalent of the Clean Air Act with regard to greenhouse gases. Um, we do have obligations. There are obligations to say regulate or reduce these emissions through maybe corporate securities law, energy and natural resource law, and now the new Building Act that Biden passed, where he is the Infrastructure Act. Lost that for a second. Where now the requirements for greener use and when they're working on the infrastructure, keeping the environment in mind. Some states have adopted their own climate change statutes, but again, no congressional action. This, I think, is a quiz question, so remember that. So it's kind of undisputed that congressional action on this issue would have been the most efficient way to deal with it, but any attempt at legislation on this has failed. So here's like our kind of successes on this. Oh, are there two S's in successes? I don't know. So way back, 1978, under President Carter, the National Climate Program Act. So that created this National Climate Program. And this, again, we're studying it, increasing the government's understanding of climate change and its effects, maybe stimulate a more flexible and resilient society. Okay, so it's kind of, we're thinking about the climate in 1978, believe it or not. 1987, Reagan. Scientists are like, holy cow, we have a hole in the ozone. Things are bad. So this Global Climate Protection Act, I just encouraged a coordinated national policy on climate change. So all the agencies working together, but didn't tell them there's nothing in the statute specifically on how to achieve that. George Bush the first under him, the Congress passed the U.S. Global Change Research Act. Because the Clean Air Act amendments still did not address. So Clean Air Act, until very, very recently, did not address greenhouse gas emissions. So this statute created the U.S. Global Change Research Program, nice little acronym, and all they do is create a climate assessment report every 4 years. So again, we're studying it, we're looking at it. So that was what, 1990. 1990 to 2009. So this is, 2 Bushes and a Clinton. So this is right. Remember, I was talking about the UN. The UN has these conventions on climate change, the UNFCCC, that the framework on climate change that was ratified under Bush 2. 1997, the Kyoto Protocol, which was an agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that was approved by Clinton. Congress never ratified it. And then 2001, under George W. Bush, the Kyoto Protocol was still kind of out there. And remember, protocols are those like implementation of treaties, right? So that's your protocol. But he never submitted the Kyoto Protocol to be ratified by Congress. Now, like Bush, McCain-Lieberman, those were like environmental like attempts to regulate greenhouse gases. So in 23, that bill failed. But in the appropriations bill, right, the budget, it did require major emitters, like, say, our electric companies, to report, to start measuring and reporting their greenhouse gas emissions. And then there were also stricter fuel economy standards, right? Even we know that our cars are now required to have better fuel economy than in the past. Nancy Pelosi formed a select committee on energy independence and global warming. Again, it's a committee with advice but no legislation was passed. 2008, Lieberman's still trying. Lieberman and Warner bill was proposed and failed. Okay, so this we have some familiarity with this Mass versus EPA. Okay, so under Massachusetts versus EPA, so the EPA said we don't have the authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. That's not a pollutant that we've regulated before. We don't have the authority. Remember, the EPA cannot exceed their statutory mandate. Okay, so Mass versus EPA found that yes, greenhouse gases are pollutants under the Clean Air Act. So they had some authority to regulate them. So EPA on its own, because it's the agency with the expertise and the knowledge, they had to independently make it a determination whether these greenhouse gases were reasonably anticipated to endanger health or welfare, right? So the Clean Air Act allows the EPA to regulate pollutants that are anticipated to endanger health and welfare. Okay, so EPA hadn't made that determination. So it basically kicked the question back to the EPA. And they're reviewing this, that they have discretion to regulate carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. So they have to figure out, well, do these kinds of emissions, can they endanger health and welfare? Whatever their current rationale was for not regulating greenhouse gases was not adequate. And if they were not going to do it, they had to tell the court and the world why they were not regulating greenhouse gases. So this gave the EPA the go-ahead to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. Okay, so what was that? What year was that? 2007. So Obama, he, in his heart, wanted climate change legislation passed. That's what he wanted. He thought that the Clean Air Act was a messy way to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, and there should be new legislation. And that's what he really wanted, but he never proposed a climate change law. Okay. And, under his administration. There were, now we're on Waxman and Markey. There's a couple of greenhouse gas regulation statutes proposed, Waxman Marley, Kerry Boxer, never allowed. Never, this one never was even debated on the Senate floor. This one passed the House, but not the Senate. Okay, so he really wanted it to be not through the Clean Air Act. He wanted a separate legislation, but it didn't happen. Yeah, see, he thought that new legislation was the way to go. He threatened regulations that might have been kind of onerous as a way to push the legislation. And the first regulations actually happened in 2009, where there was then now a registry for greenhouse gas reporting for all sectors, not just the highest polluters. Okay, all emitters had to report their greenhouse gas emissions annually to gather data. So that was the first thing that the EPA did, this reporting rule in 2009. Okay, in July 2008, the EPA issued this advance notice of public rulemaking. So they hadn't done anything yet, but they're like, we're going to do this. Saying, it's really hard to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. And there's a lot of obstacles, and it's really hard to do that. And they believe that, these regs would increase the cost of energy and transportation without a, significant benefit on, reducing global greenhouse gases. So that's what they said. Okay. In 2009, so that was 2008. Remember, we were looking for under Mass versus EPA that they had to find that greenhouse gases had endangered the public health or welfare. So they found that. And then 2010, they started actually limiting the greenhouse gas emissions, right? Making standards. That's the light duty vehicle rule. So it's like, regular cars and light duty trucks. Okay. Yeah. Cars, trucks, minivans, buses, motorcycles. Obviously not this. I don't think this is like semis. I think it's just like people trucks. Okay. So in model year 2012 was the first limit, and then it got stricter in 2016. You wonder why now cars are really car manufacturers are trying to go all electric, because they have these emission standards are just going to get stricter and stricter. So EVs are the way to go. Okay, so Obama's second term. So he's still been unsuccessful in having major any congressional regulation, congressional laws passed on regulating greenhouse gases. So he comes up with this clean power plan, and he wanted to regulate emissions, CO2 emissions from these power plants. Like, remember we on that American Electric Power Company that we read, the biggest emitters were these power plants, and created incentives to shift from coal and fossil fuels to wind, solar, cleaner energy. The final rules under the Clean Power Plan were issued in 2015, but then they were challenged by many states. Right, so they're saying no, we don't have the authority. Right, it's not an act. This is all through like administrative and action and executive order. So the final rules were issued by the EPA, right? So courts challenged this. I mean, states challenged this, and the DC Circuit was ready to hear arguments. They call that en banc. All of the judges in the DC Circuit were going to hear this argument. But what happened was Trump was elected. Obama was still president, but Trump was elected. And then the DC Circuit's like, this might not matter in a couple of months when our new president is sworn in. So they defer their decision. Still, yeah. So they didn't rule on it. So then Trump became president, and he replaced the Clean Power Plan with the Affordable Clean Energy Rule. And that's in 2019, which is weaker. So we're in 2012. No, the Paris Agreement. Paris Accord is 20. I thought it was 2015. I guess it's 2016. Okay, the Paris Agreement. So this is that United Nations Convention, UNFCCC, and there was an agreement between all the parties who are a party to the Paris Agreement to commit to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as a country. And the US was a party to this agreement. Okay, so in 2016, Trump was elected. He came into office in January of 2017, and in June, he announced his intention to withdraw from the agreement. So the terms of the agreement says, well, you can't just say I'm out. There's a 3-year period, and then so the earliest effective date was November 2020. So we're in the Paris Agreement for like a minute, and then we're out. 5 minutes later. Okay, so under Donald Trump, he shifted the policy priorities, with regard to global warming and greenhouse gases. He really wanted the United States to not be dependent on foreign oil. So he wanted, drilling. He wanted coal mining. He wanted pipelines, right? So that we're independent of foreign whims on prices of oil and gas. Okay, so he rescinded a lot of the environmental regulations, right? So remember, everything that's coming, these regulations are coming from the EPA. EPA is part of the executive branch. So the policies come from the president. Okay, so he rolled back like almost 100 of these environmental rules and regulations that were existing. He supported, development of federal protected lands. He had gas and oil drilling in national forests and near national monuments. He approved 2 oil pipelines by executive order. He allowed mining in the Minnesota boundary waters, if you have ever visited there, and in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, allowed drilling. He did not believe. He might have believed that there is climate change, but he didn't believe that climate change would have any catastrophic effect, and he did not believe that carbon dioxide is the primary contributor to climate change. And then again, he left the Paris Accord. So that's Trump. So we read about Connecticut versus American Electric, right? The states filed this nuisance claim, right? Common law claim against 5 electric power companies. And, the Supreme Court held that it was a political question and could not be resolved by tort law. So the court didn't act. So, it's kind of like a thing, right? Like, all right, we're going to try to get congressional legislation. All right, well, that's not working. So let's go to the courts. Right. So Mass versus EPA actually did a lot to get the EPA off its behind to actually start regulating greenhouse gases. So Juliana versus US is like a very interesting case. So there's like 30 young adults from their tweens to the early 20s, and they claim that the U.S. government violated their rights by allowing activities that resulted in the emission of greenhouse gases, and so that infringed upon their right to life and liberty. Okay, you cannot deprive me of life and liberty without due process of the laws, right? That's our Constitution. So they're saying you allowing all of these greenhouse gas emissions is infringing on my right to life and liberty. The case actually survived a few rounds of appeals, but in January of 2020, the Ninth Circuit dismissed it for lack of standing. So they're saying, it's not an actual case or controversy, similar to, the Connecticut versus American Electric political question. You don't want the courts, creating statutes And that's what happened to Juliana. But it's kind of like a cool concept. So I'm going to stop this, and this is our discussion board for the week on that Juliana case. So why don't we stop this, and then you can take a look at the discussion board, and then come back to the last video.